And I just got the reading questions pulled up just to kind of help guide us a little bit. So in chapter 2, we see Scout going to school for the first time. And she's been, very excited to be able to go with Jem. And she has this new teacher, right? Miss Caroline. So she describes her on page 21. Miss Caroline was no more than 21. She had bright auburn hair, pink cheeks, and wore crimson fingernail polish. She also wore high-heeled pumps and a red and white striped dress. She looked and smelled like a peppermint drop. She boarded across the street, etc. So kind of just describing her as very like almost cutesy, right? Like very, I don't know. This is not the way that she's described the rest of the town, right? It's like a sleepy town. It's muddy. It's like dirty, right? This is very like antithetical to everything that she's described so far. So we kind of already are getting some hints that maybe Miss Caroline's not going to fit in so well in Maycomb. And we also learn, at 21, she's very young. So this is probably like her first teaching job as well. And yeah, things don't go so well for Scout on the first day of school. So Miss Caroline finds out that Scout can read, and she has a very ironic reaction to that. How does she react? Yeah, she tells her not to do it, right? Which you wouldn't assume. You would assume a teacher would be really excited that one of their students could already read, and then that's one less student that you have to teach to read, right? So this is irony, right? Situational irony, the exact opposite of what happens is what, the exact opposite of what we would expect is what happens. So we would expect a teacher to be happy and excited that a student could read already, but she is not. And she basically just says like that her father has damaged her, right, by teaching her to read because he doesn't know how to teach, which is just very silly. All right. So we also get a certain sense about the town in general and sort of their thoughts and their value that they place on education. We learn that like a lot of students really just come for a little while and then drop out, right? There's lots of students that have like, they're repeating the first grade, some of them for several times, okay? Which if you just remember the time period, a lot of these kids had to like go home and work, right? And help to support their family, even at such a young age. So we're introduced to a family here, the Cunninghams. Okay, Walter Cunningham is in Scout's class. And how can we describe the Cunninghams? What are they like? What are some of their characteristics? They're not what? They're not like the other things. Oh, the Ewells. Yeah. Yeah, they're very poor, right? On page 26, let's see, 27 actually towards the bottom. It says the Cunninghams are country folks, farmers, and the crash hit them the hardest. Atticus said professional people were poor because the farmers were poor. So they're very poor, but they really try, their farming family. She explains how when the Cunninghams needed Atticus to do some legal work for them, they tried to pay him back however they could. So, maybe they bring him some products versus actually paying in money, that kind of thing. And you also, on page 26, she says, the Cunninghams never took anything they can't pay back. No church baskets and no script stamps. They never took anything off of anybody. They get along on what they have. They don't get much. They don't have much, but they get along on it. So if you think back to, again, we'll kind of keep going back to this sort of social hierarchy. So the Cunninghams would kind of fall in this like second tier here, maybe kind of like the bottom of this second tier. because they are so poor, but they do work and they try hard to, you know, not take handouts from anyone, to be sort of as independent as they can, to pay people back, you know, maybe with products or, you know, with something, services versus money, but they're still trying to like kind of make an honest, you know, an honest go of it. So Scout kind of gets in trouble for explaining this to Miss Caroline, right? Because Miss Caroline's trying to give Walter money for lunch and he like refuses to take it. And Scout kind of tries to explain that to her, which again makes her sort of Miss Caroline's target, right? Yeah, because she says on page 28, you're shaming him. He doesn't have a quarter to bring you and you can't use any stove wood. So she makes Scout come up and she hits her hand with a ruler, which is like kind of, I don't know, type of punishment that they would give back then. And then she would have to go and like stand in the corner in front of the whole class. So like a very, not a good first impression of the teacher for Scout, right? She's not going to really enjoy her teacher very much. Let me see here. Okay. So then in chapter 3, Scout is kind of mad at Walter for getting her in trouble, right? Because she tried to like explain what was going on. But Jem invites him home. It says to dinner, so that's lunch. They just called dinner lunch. I don't know, some people's families might still do that. Dinner and then supper. Like I would call it lunch and dinner, but some people do say dinner and supper for lunch and dinner. So they invite him back to the house, okay? Why does Atticus kind of treat Walter like kind of an adult, right? He talks to him like very differently than he talks to his children. Why would Atticus do that? On page 32, it says, while Walter piled food on his plate, he and Atticus talked together like two men, to the wonderment of Jem and me. Atticus was expounding upon farm problems when Walter interrupted to ask if there was any molasses in the house. So what does that kind of tell us about Walter? Yeah, definitely. He's been forced to grow up faster than the other kids. He kind of has almost like an adult role in his family, right? He helps his dad, helps his family to kind of make ends meet. So Atticus treats him sort of more as an equal versus as a child because he does have that extra responsibility. And then we get this part about Walter pouring syrup all over his food. So again, we have to think about the time period, right? It's the Great Depression. Walter's family certainly never has anything like indulgent like that at his house. So it's like very much a treat. And Scout and Jem's family is much better off than his family. So he pours syrup on his food, which, you know, seems gross probably to us and to Scout definitely. And so Scout kind of like points it out, right? Like that he's drowned his dinner in syrup. I asked him what he was doing. Calpurnia pulls her into the kitchen, and this is a really important quote from the book. So on the bottom of page 32, top of page 33, she says, there's some folks who don't eat like us, but you ain't called on to contradict them at the table when they don't. That boy's your company, and if he wants to eat up the tablecloth, you let him, you hear? And Scout says, he ain't company, Cal, he's just a Cunningham, right? So you think about, again, the social hierarchy, right? Well, he's not the same as us, he's just a Cunningham, he's down in this category, right? And keep in mind, Scout's like a child here. Calpurnia says, hush your mouth. It doesn't matter who they are. Anybody that sets foot in this house is your company. And don't you let me catch you remarking on their ways like you was so high and mighty. Your folks might be better than the Cunninghams, but it don't count for nothing the way you're disgracing them. If you can't act fit to eat at the table, you can just sit here and eat in the kitchen. So what's Calpurnia kind of telling her here? Like, what's the lesson that Calpurnia is trying to teach her? Any thoughts? Anybody that sets foot in this house is your company, and don't you let me catch you remarking on their ways like you are so high and mighty. Your folks might be better than the Cunninghams, but it doesn't count for nothing the way you're disgracing them. What does she mean?
Even though the scout is like better than her company, like shouldn't treat like it.
Yeah, she's basically saying like you need to treat everyone the same regardless, right? If they're in your home, they're your company, like that's your guest, and you need to treat them with respect no matter who they are, right? No matter which level of society they're from, you need to be treating everyone the same, because otherwise you're basically just, you are like basically not, I don't want to say trash, but like you're just doing your family a disgrace if you don't treat people with kindness, right? So again, you already start to see kind of ideas of, we talked about these themes, right? Prejudice. And so prejudice we talked about can mean like not only against different races, but like against different social classes, right? And just treating everyone equally. And that kind of goes into maturation too, just like as you get older, you sort of learn, you know, how to treat people. But this is definitely a first kind of hint at this idea of sort of how, you know, everyone should be treated with respect regardless of their social class. Okay, so then we go back to school and we meet another family, the Yules, and we've already talked about them a little bit in this social hierarchy here. They're in this kind of yellow. We meet Burris Yule, right? And Miss Caroline on page 34 is screaming about something that has crawled out of Burris's hair. So she calls it a cootie, but what is it really? What kind of a bug would climb out of someone's hair typically? Like lice, yeah. But like big enough that she can see it. So I mean, that's pretty big, right? Lice is usually like microscopic. So already that leads us to infer something about Burris, right? If he has lice so big that you can see it from across the room, what can we infer about the way that he lives? Yeah, pretty dirty, right? Probably aren't bathing very frequently, versus like if you think about like the Cunninghams, where we talk about Walter being like clean and put together and very respectful. Burris is like the complete opposite, okay? Okay, so she wants him to go home and wash his hair, okay, to get rid of the lice. On page 35 at the bottom, it says, he was the filthiest human I'd ever seen. His neck was dark gray and the back of his hands were rusty, and his fingernails were deep black, deep into the quick. And he doesn't really appreciate Miss Caroline sending him home. He says, "You're not sending me home. I was on the verge of leaving. I've done my time for this year." And so Scout explains on page 36, he's one of the Yules, ma'am. The whole school is full of them. They come the first day every year and then leave. The truant lady gets them here because she threatens them with the sheriff, but she gives up trying to hold them. She reckons she's carried out the law, just getting their names on the roll and running them up here the first day. You're supposed to mark them absent the rest of the year. Okay, so Burris says he's been coming to the first day of first grade for 3 years. And then Miss Caroline and Burris kind of get into this confrontation, right? She asks him to sit down. He says, "You try and make me." And the boy, yells at her, right? Calls her some names, says that you're not making me go anywhere, right? Make sure that she was crying, etc. So the Yules are very different from the Cunninghams. They are both like dirt poor, okay? But the Yules are happy to like take handouts, right? Have like the rules not apply to them, just sort of like live in kind of filth and just sort of be mean and angry. Versus the Cunninghams, who are like in the red up here, are more like trying their best, have bad circumstances, but are still trying to be like respectful and kind and all of those things. Okay. So it's an important distinction just to remember these two families, the Cunninghams versus the Yules. Both of these families factor in later on in the story. And particularly the Yules, you just want to think about what their home life is like, sort of these characteristics of their family, you really want to remember for later on in the story. Okay. Okay. So at the end of the chapter, Atticus talks to Scout about how Scout doesn't enjoy school, and they talk about the Yules, right? On page 40, Atticus says the Yules had been the disgrace of Macomb for 3 generations. None of them had done an honest day's work in his recollection. They live out by the dump. And he kind of mentions like how, certain laws don't really apply to their family, right? Like they let the father hunt and trap out of season, even though it's against the law. Basically, like the dad is just not supporting the family at all. And so everyone kind of feels bad for the kids. So they just kind of like let stuff go because they don't want to like make it any harder on the children who are like in a very bad situation. Okay. What is the agreement that Scout and her father come to eventually about school? Because she says she doesn't want to go anymore. Page 41 at the bottom, he says, if you'll concede the necessity of going to school, we'll go on reading every night just as we always have. Is it a bargain? And she says yes. Okay, so they're agreeing that she's going to go to school, but he'll continue to read to her. They're going to kind of ignore what Miss Caroline said about reading. Another important quote in this chapter on page 39, right? She's complaining about Miss Caroline. He says, first of all, if you can learn a simple trick, Scout, you'll get along a lot better with all kinds of folks. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view. Sir, and then he says, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. Atticus said I had learned many things today, and Miss Caroline had learned several things herself. She had learned not to hand something to a Cunningham, for one thing. But if Walter and I had put ourselves in her shoes, we would have seen it was an honest mistake on her part. We could not expect her to learn all of Macomb's ways in one day, and we could not hold her responsible for when she knew no better. Okay, so again, this is going to be a very big sort of motif, which is like a repeated idea in a book. This idea of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Okay, that's like another one of the big lessons of this novel is considering things from another person's point of view. Okay. All right, so that's chapters 2 and 3. And then chapters 4 and 5, which you were supposed to read on your own. We kind of jump ahead again a little bit in time, okay? So we skip ahead, as the year passed, et cetera, et cetera. So this is, again, the start of another motif, which, again, is just a repetitive thing in a book. There's these 2 live oak trees that stand at the edge of the Radley lot. And Scout finds something in them. So what's this first thing that she finds? Gum, right? And she's like immediately gonna like put it in her mouth and start chewing it. Again, think about the time period. Gum is like a rarity. That's like a special treat that you would not just go and be able to buy, right? You were really not like getting any like extra frivolous things, okay? So she finds this gum. She finds 2 pieces of gum, right? And then later on in the chapter, they find something else. What do they find next? Yeah, they find these 2 pennies that have like been shined up and are obviously like very well cared for. So just note that there's always 2 things left, right? 2 pieces of gum, 2 pennies. So we'll just kind of keep an eye on that tree and see what happens. Okay, they start to play this Boo Radley game. What's the Boo Radley game? Yeah, they act out all of these stories about him, right? Atticus doesn't love this game, right? This is certainly not a very kind game to be playing, to sort of be poking fun at someone in their neighborhood. They tell them to stop. Now, Scout also has an interesting encounter in this chapter. They're rolling in a tire. So, imagine like a tire of a car. She like gets down in it and they push her so that like she's, spinning as she goes down the road. And she falls into the Radley yard, right? And we don't learn until the very end of the chapter that something made her very nervous. What happens when she rolls into the yard? Very end of the chapter, we learn. Yeah, she hears laughing. So it says, Atticus's arrival was the second reason I wanted to quit the game. The first reason happened the day I rolled into the Radley front yard. Through all the head shaking, quelling of nausea, and Jem yelling, I had heard another sound so low I could not have heard it from the sidewalk. Someone inside the house was laughing. So what does that tell us about the person inside the house? What have they been doing? Yeah, they've been watching the kids, okay? And remember, to us, maybe we're like, okay, yeah, our neighbor saw us, whatever. But they have all these stories about Boo and how he's gonna come and get them in the middle of the night, and he's this like terror in their neighborhood. So of course, the idea of him watching them is going to really freak her out. In chapter 5, we meet Miss Maudie. What are some of her characteristics? How does she treat the children? Yeah, she's very nice to them, very kind to them, bakes them little cakes and things. And what's her main hobby that she enjoys doing? Gardening, right? She has this beautiful garden. She loves flowers. And she's lived in the neighborhood a very long time. She knows a lot about the Radley family, which is kind of what Scout asks her about. Okay, and we start to learn a little bit more about the reasons why the Radleys are the way that they are. So she calls them foot washing Baptists. This is on page 59. So this can get confusing for people. She says, old Mr. Radley was a foot washing Baptist. That's what you are, ain't it? My shell's not that hard, child. I'm just a Baptist. Don't you all believe in foot washing? We do at home in the bathtub. Miss Maudie goes on to say, foot washers believe anything that's pleasure is a sin. Did you know some of them came out of the woods one Saturday and passed by this place and told me that me and my flowers were going to hell? Yes, ma'am, they'd burn right with me. They thought I spent too much time in God's outdoors and not enough time inside reading the Bible. Okay, so she's saying that the Radleys are very, very strict Baptists. Like they have this view that, like it says, anything that is pleasure is sin. So like if you enjoy gardening, then that's sinful. And Miss Maudie's point is like, I'm just out, like I'm enjoying, what does she say? God's outdoors, right? But they say, no, you should be inside reading the Bible. Okay. So Miss Maudie is really saying that like, this is kind of why Boo, Arthur is his real name, has sort of become this like recluse and like never comes out of the house, because his father is so strictly religious that then, you know, when Boo did act out as a young child, like he was really sort of chastised for that, and then like just chooses not to go out anymore because of that. Okay, another important quote here on page 60. Miss Maudie says, "You are too young to understand it, but sometimes the Bible in the hand of one man is worse than a whiskey bottle in the hand of your father." So Scout, again, she's a child. She doesn't understand this sort of analogy that Miss Maudie's making. She's like, well, Atticus doesn't drink whiskey. What are you talking about? Miss Maudie goes on and says, what I meant was, if Atticus Finch drank until he was drunk, he wouldn't be as hard as some men are at their best. There are just some kind of men who are so busy worrying about the next world, they never learn to live in this one. And you can look down the street and see the results. So she's basically saying that like there are some people in the world who use religion as an excuse to like do terrible things, right? Like keep their child like in their house and like not allow their child to like have any freedoms and things like that. That like some people can use, you know, can sort of take it like to an extreme, like, and that's what she's saying this family does, that they sort of have this idea of, you know, anything that's pleasure is a sin, so like you can't even garden. I mean, that seems like pretty extreme to me. And that's sort of why Boo is the way that he is. Of course, she doesn't believe all of the rumors about him, you know, eating squirrels and things like that. She's like, you know, he just chooses to stay in the house for other reasons. But that's an important quote as well that we will see come up frequently. Okay. All right. They then in this chapter also decide they want to get a note to Boo. They're going to drop it over through like with a fishing pole. Atticus, of course, catches them. And Jem is very upset about being caught by that as well. Okay, and so then that's the end of chapter 5. So any questions on anything that happens in chapters 1 through 5? Okay,